What's up, everyone, and welcome to another episode of the Yours Truly podcast. I'm your host, Christian Baxter. Today, we have Rick Walker here with us in the Yours Truly virtual studio. Rick could be described as a businessman from Texas, and with a name like Rick Walker, that's exactly what you'd expect. What you wouldn't expect is that his introduction into this little corner of the internet came by way of using his knowledge of the existence of Grim Grizz as a way to get Paul Vanderklay's attention on an email. There's no getting around these things like the hermeneutics of suspicion when being an operator in the digital space like the TLC. Some thought I was too slick when I came in with my 4K camera and my black wall, and the same could be the case for Rick. Rick was obviously too slick for the blue-collar aesthetic of the TLC, but Paul talked to him anyway. And then Chad and then Karen Wong over on the meeting code. The question persists. Why is a successful businessman from Houston paying attention to this little corner of the internet? We're going to get into that and more of his story today, as well as discuss his new book, 9 Steps to Building a Meaningful Life. I tried to get Rick on the pod about a year ago. It didn't quite work out, but I think it's working out at just the right time for everyone listening today. I'm looking forward to seeing where this conversation takes us here on the Yours Truly podcast. First, don't forget to like and subscribe for the algo. Subscribe to let the channel grow its influence, or become a channel member if you'd like to support the work of Yours Truly financially. And check out Rick's book, 9 Steps to Building a Meaningful Life, on Amazon or Audible and all the usual places. He also has a podcast where he recently had a conversation with none other than Jonathan Pageau. I had the distinct pleasure of bumping into Rick when we were at the art conference earlier this year. And we had a conversation there. It was a weird series of events that we actually met right in the main thoroughfare of the conference center. And then had the pleasure of having dinner with him and Paul, Bethel McGrew, Teo, and Harris, many others from this corner of the internet, our friend Peter Penrose Bach. And it was a really wonderful assortment at that dinner the last night of the conference. So it's going to be good to catch back up with Rick here today and share this conversation with you all out there paying attention. So without any further delay, I give you Rick Walker, Texas businessman.
Hi, this is Christian Baxter, and you're listening to Yours Truly, a place we go to think out loud.
All right, Rick Walker in the virtual studio. So Rick, today I wanted to just start. I said this in the intro. You used, as part of the lore of you hanging out in this little corner of the internet, is you used Grim Grizz as a reference on an email to Paul Vanderklay to get Paul's attention. And that kind of, the term, I think it was Vervaeke that kind of popularized it, and people in the corner started talking about hermeneutics of suspicion was, projected upon you from that move. And the same thing, I actually received a similar treatment because I was kind of using a 4K camera in a webcam world, and it was like, what's going on here? And so those kind of questions were on people's mind. And I know since, you had a conversation on Karen Wong's channel, obviously been on Paul's, you did like a live stream with Paul. You did kind of a rando story on Paul Vanderklay's channel. I think you had a conversation with Chad on his channel. And so kind of what drew you in? Obviously there's like the Peterson connection, but how did you kind of find this and start getting for at different times, like kind of poking your head into this kind of weird internet subculture down here?
Great question, Christian. I appreciate you having me on. First, a point of clarification. I did screenshot the email that I sent to Paul and posted it to Twitter. The context was highly different than what the different podcasts were talking about after that. So essentially, I said something to the effect of, I'm following this space, and so I know the names like Matthew and Grizz, and I think I said Vervaeke or something like that.
Yeah.
I use 3 or 4 names there, and so implying that I don't know them personally, not that they would vouch for me, but like I know who they are.
Yeah.
And so I think that was part of the suspicion. And I think Paul made a comment that I name dropped Grizz Grimm. I don't know if the phrase name drop means different things, different parts of the country. Down here in Texas, it means it's someone that you say would vouch for you. And I certainly didn't phrase it that way nor intend that way, but I'm sure it may have different connotations or different meanings in other parts of the country. And so that was certainly an exciting introduction to the corner. I first came through I want to say the way that I think about it is sort of the Peterson, and then you've got Pageau, and then you've got PVK, and then you've got everyone else sort of, and that's where the true corner starts. And I'm sure I'm messing some of that up somewhere. But the connection was that I had interviewed Pageau on my third podcast ever, maybe 2 years prior to that.
Okay.
2 years prior to that. And so for me to know who Paul was, I would imagine it was the algo sometime in that time frame. Obviously, I would have had to have already known who Pageau was and been watching this stuff somehow to know to invite him on the channel. And he was my third podcast guest ever. And funny enough, we recorded a follow-up podcast that Jonathan and I did last week, and I'll be posting it this week, I think, at some point.
I mentioned it in my introduction that you had that coming up.
Okay.
Yeah.
Cool. Yeah. So that should be fun. We actually talk about business quite a bit, how the symbolic world is functioning, and we get in some rabbit trails as well. So it'll be fun. But the idea was that obviously JBP first, then Pageau, then PVK, then you and Grizz and everyone, Karen, obviously. In the channel, I don't want to try to name everyone because I'm going to miss somebody. But I the algorithm kind of sit me down the hierarchy in proper fashion. I'll just say that.
Yeah. What did you see? Because I remember you saying at one point, you're like, sometimes I'll put on some of these like live streams where people are just talking when I've been driving. Like, what were you thinking whenever you kind of discovered there was kind of this subculture? Like, what kind of struck you whenever you kind of saw a little bit of that?
Well, first off, there was high authenticity, and authenticity and trust have a very high correlation in my book. And so I'm not looking for people that have large channels, not looking for people that sound smart, that want to talk about intellectual ideas, although there's plenty of that in this sort of space in the internet. I was looking for something, and what I guess first attracted me, I guess I wasn't looking for, the algo was kind of putting out there to see if I would pick it up. I found that the authenticity was refreshing versus everything else that was in my feed. I also found that the personalities were very interesting. And as I sort of pieced things together, realizing that this group is also interacting not only on X, but also on a Discord server, or maybe multiple servers, I don't know, that there's other side conversations going on that helped me start putting 2 and 2 together and realizing, I'm not getting the full picture. And so that all obviously added to the allure of that. But yeah, I'm, if you look at my feed these days, it's probably 50% business would be my guess. So I'm not seeing like a full TLC type of feed. I'm seeing probably a lot broader would be my guess. But I obviously try to pick up where I can. I enjoy listening to live streams. I think you and I spoke a few weeks ago, and when I'm in the car, sometimes I'll put the phone on the side and leave the screen on, and so you've got these little boxes here, and all I can tell is like, this is a young person, this is an old person, but I can never really tell what the name is because the name's so small on it. And I think I mentioned to you is there's a young man in the bottom right hand corner in the previous podcast, and come to find out it was President Foxman, who obviously I know, and so it was just one of those funny things where I'm hearing voices and I'm seeing kind of youngish faces, but they're so tiny, it takes me a little while to kind of pick up. But yeah, I think I had my first conversation with Paul maybe 2 years ago, something like that, about
Yeah.
maybe 22, 24 months ago, something like that. Yeah.
Yeah. So it was an interesting thing for me because I kind of had this similar experience where I had been listening to kind of the high people like Pageau and Vervaeke and other people after the Peterson phenomenon. And I saw Paul very early on, and then I was doing a lot of other stuff, listening to a lot of other things. And I would just, and sometimes maybe I would hear them say something like This Little Corner. And it was kind of for a while, it was more of a general thing.
Yeah.
And yeah. And then there was one time Paul was doing like a live stream, like he had begun doing more and more with StreamYard and stuff. And I was like, what is this? Oh, there's actually people having a conversation. It's not just content in a way. And I thought that to me struck me. I don't think I could have articulated it that way 2 years ago, but trying to, offering an opportunity to have a conversation about these things that all this input for so long. So that was what kind of struck me. I think it's interesting. Like you mentioned authenticity and trust, and those are big ideas. And so and the other piece you said, you've mentioned, I in the introduction, I call you a Texas businessman. And with a name like Rick Walker, Texas, there's so much in there, man. And so it's like, but that is an interesting thing. It's to say, I guess the follow-up question to that I'm interested in is, and I know your story's out there, and just insert as much as you want to, and people that are probably going to find this. Some of them probably watched your conversations with Paul and Karen, but how much of, if you were watching the Peterson phenomenon, what was it that struck you specifically and where you were at in life that it was meaningful for you and had your attention at that point?
Yeah. So I was paying early attention to Peterson, not necessarily for what I could get out of it, but how I could use that information to adapt my messaging to people that I was dealing with in work and nonprofit work. And so just a little bit of background, I've been very disciplined. In fact, if you run a Berkman assessment, I'm 99% out of 100% discipline and organization. I'm very, very highly organized. And so I also have, the Texan thing. And so there's a little bit of a risk-taking apparatus somewhere within me. And so you can sort of put those two things together. You eventually do some stuff. And so I had a background in my 20s and 30s of building organizations, built one up to 400, built one up to over 2,000 staff in 53 countries. And I say that not to say that I was competent, but I say that just to let you know, like these are very complex things. As a very immature 20 and 30-year-old, I didn't have a clue what I was doing. And so in my 30s, when JVP came on the scene, I needed a language. I needed a framework to have these conversations with people that were my organization, because sometimes through my mid 30s, it flipped where everyone was older than me in work and also in these nonprofit organizations that I was leading. And then sometime around 35, I noticed that, hey, I've got to be able to recruit and hire and train and employ and mentor these younger men. I don't have a framework for that. So that was sort of hitting around the same time. I'm 46. So it was about 10, 11 years ago, which I think JVP was sort of on the scene by then. And so that's what was happening in the back of my mind. Obviously, as JVP broadened his lecture series, broadened his conversations, broadened his applicability and adaptability of his ideas, I was able to use many, many, many of those myself in my personal life, and it's been very transformative. I actually sent him a note. It would have been a month or two before he went out this past year, when he went out with his most recent illness, thanking him. I said, you inspired me to write this new book that I released in July. Sure. And he replied, thanking me. And he said, this is maybe one of the great honors of my life. He said, yeah, I gifted a copy of your book to my son-in-law. Mm. And so sort of my heart stopped there. And now whether he read it or not, who knows? I'll never know that. but it was sort of like one of the great compliments. Obviously, JVP didn't know what he was gifted in. JVP would not have read my book, but I wanted to make sure that I was thankful to him for his inspiration, his growth, his ideas out there, and those ideas really poured forth and grew and matured the concepts that I try to articulate in the book. And so I was very pleased to hear that he appreciated it. And I think that was probably back in June, would be my guess. So it was right before he went out.
Well, I think that's, people that pay attention to my channel are very, very familiar with this trajectory and this history. And I think that's why I'm excited to have that conversation with you specifically about that thread, because it was a phenomenon and it went out, millions and millions of people paying attention to this guy 5 to 7 to 8, 9 years ago. And it did so much that people needed to talk about it, and they couldn't because there was multiple things happening in the culture. It was a little bit dicey to talk about him for a while in the culture politically. You're watching, we're all watching these on our phones at work, in the car, at home, whatever, and trying to find where to have that conversation and how to connect that. I think it's interesting. You said you were using some of his principles for people that you worked with or led. So how are you making these ideas concrete in a business organization? What were some of the things you're saying before you got into where it kind of connected to you personally later on? How was that? Where was the practical connection there? I'm curious, like, if you had some specifics on that.
Yeah. So there was, because I was in business. I started my business back in my late teens. And so, assuming this is around 35, I'd been sort of in the business for 15, 16, 17 years and had a fairly decent idea about, what I was doing, but realized there was a generation behind me that I needed to help. They were struggling with different things that my generation and the generation ahead of me struggled with. But I was still using the same tools. I was still using, the John Maxwell leadership tools, the Robert Greene, the Robert Allen. I was using, we had reading programs, Peter Drucker. At one point I was making everyone in the company read a book a month.
Oh.
And so I was very, very intentional on education. But there just wasn't the resonance that I expected it to be there among certain people. And so as I began to stumble across JVP, I realized that he was resonating with different people. And so it morphed from a more structured educational approach to one that was more consultative. And what really triggered this would be a few years after this, but on one day, I think one day or 1 week, we brought in 26 or 28 MBA recent graduates that started all, I think, on the same day or the same week, 28 of them. And they all came because they were promised that they'd have some time with me and I'd be able to work with them on their career and that sort of thing. And so I think there's some expectation there. And so I withdrew the formal model, and I still gave them books to read, but I want to have more of a consultative approach. And that's really where I've tried to go since then, is try to have an interactive dialogue instead of a one-way lecture. And so I don't know, I'll never know how that really resonates in the long term, because it's only been, some of that stuff's only been 5 to 7 years. But I suspect that people appreciate the authenticity, because when you're in a back and forth, if you're a humble enough person, which I'm not a very humble person, but I have some humility because I made lots and lots of mistakes, and they're discoverable if you work in the company. You figure out that if you share your mistakes, you prevent those mistakes many times from reoccurring in your own organization, right? There's no reason to cover up your own mistakes if you're in charge of the organization, because you're gonna pay the price for that. It's not the person that just started that's gonna pay the price for it. You're gonna pay the price for it. And so why not open up and be authentic about your faults, the mistakes, the errors, the prideful moves that you've made? And so I found that was a more rewarding tone. But the conversation starts around responsibility, obviously, responsibility, purpose, family. And a lot of these guys, they didn't have any kids either, or they weren't even married or thinking about getting married. And so that was a big part of it. Obviously, I could not maintain all those relationships, but I try to meet with them every week or two to have that sort of dialogue with them. And I hope someone got something out of it.
Well, there's 2 points that makes me think about related to like philosophy and psychology, like practical philosophy. I was just listening to Chris Williamson talk to Alex O'Connor, and this other guy got a big philosophy channel. I can't remember his name, but he's actually doing speaking at the Breakwater Festival in Europe, which is like the estuary event that's happening over in Europe with Cassidy Vanderkamp and Netherlands and Germany and stuff. But they were talking about how is philosophy practical. And I think that has been part of what was so like part of the lightning of the simple thing, the clean your room meme. Yeah. And then just taking that, like you're saying, like into your business and into that practice, really, really interesting. Not just for the person, the individual, like you say, the leader, because your room was probably pretty clean by evidence of what you were saying already. So the book, I read it, or I listened to it. I audibled the book, which was, I mean, I've listened to several different books different ways, but I guess I listened to 12 Rules for Life Audible years ago now. And it's a different experience than reading. And when I was kind of thinking about this conversation, reading a book is a physical book is actually a different experience than listening. And like, I was like, I didn't write things down. I'm like in the car, I could have taken voice memos or stuff, but I really was struck in your book early on. The first, it's not the first step, but maybe it is. Which one's choose a worthy enemy?
Yeah, step one.
Step one. Well, first, I mean, the first thing to do is just to take a step, and I think that's in this corner of the internet, and even in like kind of the intellectual space. There's people talk about like intellectual masturbation of just like you're just getting your mind off on ideas, and I think what I liked about this and that practical thing that we're talking about is encouraging people to do and to build. And it's interesting that you just had that conversation with Jonathan, and you're talking about building. And I would even look around this corner of the internet that I think that's a little bit something I've been trying to encourage a little bit. You have to recognize that's going to happen or not. If you keep doing something, it's going to happen. So first step, and then we could talk about that. Yeah, let's go ahead and talk about that. Like building, taking that first step to do something. Like what is that?
So what you just articulate, Christian, is my primary complaint about the corner. I got one complaint, and I think I've even articulated in a conversation with Paul at one point. You have this ladder of abstraction. So that the purely theoretical is up here, the stuff that's sort of semi-theoretical is here, philosophy's here, the classics are sort of here, and then you've got sort of your carpentry work down here, right? You've got sort of the atoms. So you got kind of bits are always up here, atoms are down here. There's too much time spent up here. There's too much time spent in the theoretical. Again, I'm gonna call a spade because I'm a Texas guy, and I think you expect that from me. The only reason to focus on the abstract is to avoid losing entirely. If you focus entirely on that, you've got to come down here to the bottom rungs of the ladder of abstraction and talk about, I think we need to do this. I need to have this prayer time. I need to have this work time. I need to start this business. I need to train young men how to do carpentry or be in those relationships or talk to women. Usually it's these very concrete things that you need to do that either you did it or you didn't do it. Either you're a success or a failure about what you articulate needs to happen. And we avoid the failure. This is what JVP told us about a decade ago. We avoid the failure because we want to keep it in the area of the theoretical, and so that's my primary complaint. Now, this highly correlates to step one, choose one worthy enemy. This is sort of a counter theme, because my expectation is that someone that maybe picks up the book, which is called 9 Steps to Build a Life of Meaning, they're accustomed to picking up the Vervaekean thought. They're, the JBP, the other, the educated, the very educated, theoretical, scholarly types of individuals. Obviously, they have some real world experience, but they're primary scholars. But I'm not a scholar. I'm clearly not a scholar. I'm a doer. And I know a little bit of facts. I know a little bit of the theoretical, but I hang out down here. This is where I hang out. And I'm assuming that there are men that don't want to be told to set your goals, set your objectives from the goals, set your mission, here's your tactics, and build up sort of that kind of that pyramid of how you reach your goals. Step one, step two. Because if you're like me, when I was in my 20s, I didn't know what the hell I wanted. I never met anyone that had anything that I'd be happy to have. Everyone had miserable marriages or miserable jobs or miserable kids. There's just misery all around. So I never had a positive vision of what I did want. But I did have a negative vision growing up poor. I did have a negative vision of what I did not want. And having that negative vision of what I did not want gave me a little bit of a boost to be able to work my way out of that. And when I started to move to work away from being poor, I didn't want to be rich. I just didn't want to be broke. I didn't want to be dumpster diving in the back of an H-E-B grocery store for dented cans. That's what it boils down to. And from that, I started the first business. I began to work that up. I'd never met anyone that had as many employees that I had. I never met anyone that was rich, but I didn't have a positive vision of what I wanted. I did have a negative vision. Now the clear question is, Rick, that's great, but I don't have sort of hatred of what I don't want, and I don't have a positive vision, so I'm sort of stuck here. Or I'm used to failing, or I know I'm going to fail. I know I'm going to give up because I always give up. The purpose of light is to invade the darkness. The purpose of the good man is to invade the evil that he sees around him. There are manifest evils around us, Christian. It may be the fentanyl in the public schools. It may be the wokest ideologies in our Sunday school classes. It may be the alcoholism that has destroyed the 2 or 3 generations before us. There's some manifest evil that we're all exposed to. And if you can identify that one manifest evil that breaks your heart, you can identify a worthy enemy that will propel you out of that place where you never have a positive vision. Let that worthy enemy that breaks your heart, let that be that negative vision of what you don't want to exist in the world. Because I believe that's codified in your DNA as someone who desires to be good, although we know we're not good. Right? We desire to be light, and we know that definitionally that the light has to invade the darkness. And that's sort of my first step. That's the difference between the scholarly work and sort of my practicality of work. That we've got to move, and through that movement, we develop the competency, we develop the tools, we develop the friendships, and everything, the teams that we need to have in place to move on in life.
There's a lot there. The one thing that I believe is that the industriousness, sometimes even if you're just being authentic in it, it still is shameful if you encounter it and you feel and you see, oh, I'm not, and that's a struggle that many young people have. And the other piece is it's easy to talk, it's hard to do, and I think there's the idea. This is the big critique. Kind of some of the lore in this corner of the internet actually was Jonathan Pageau talked to David Fuller, who started Rebel Wisdom. I don't know if you remember or were aware of that. David Fuller created the first documentary about Jordan Peterson called Glitch in the Matrix. Okay. And he followed him around a little bit, and it was kind of during the Kathy Newman. Dave Fuller had worked at the BBC, and so all that stuff that was coming along that time. And Jonathan, of course, they were all talking. He said, you're even that name, like Rebel Wisdom, like you're building it off the negative, like that conversation. He said you can't build something off like a negative. I'd say you can. He obviously was, but like it's not gonna go forward into the future without a positive vision. And then two, that's kind of the critique of being a Protestant, of being and I've started thinking about, that word, it's more identifying with Reformation than protest, as a positive vision for the future, those types of things. And then the third thing, which is one of the things I would say that I learned from participating in this course on the internet and the kind of aesthetic and dynamic, was to just start and to just play, which I think there's actually a virtue to that. But you play in the sandbox and you build some sandcastles and then they go away and you're like, well, maybe I want to build a clubhouse, like that's good. Well, now I could build like a tree house. Oh, and that's going to take some more. And that is, I think that's the natural progression of way forward. And I kind of see that with Paul leaning into the estuary movement that he's doing, and there being that kind of happening. So I do think there is a way in which some of we're in that season. But I do think it's also an honest critique. And I'll just be frank, you talk, the struggle of pride versus being proud of something you've done. And I'm I was quiet. I didn't do anything on the internet for like 6 years after I experienced some intense failure in my life. And when I came in, I was ready to play, but I was also ready to build and ready to see, I didn't know how I was going to do that, but I just find a lot of resonance there on that piece about the right enemy. This is the part that I was really, really struck with in your book, and which will be linked in. I mentioned it in the description or in the introduction, but that the way you described evil, you had this experience where a lot of young, financially successful men, I guess you were still in your 20s because this was around after 9/11, were taken, and you were shown some very graphic images of terror in the Middle East. And you were describing evil in a way that's not very popular in our culture, to describe evil. And that was really striking to me. And I was wondering if you could unpack a little bit about your perception and your understanding of evil in the world. I know that was kind of a weird segue, but it's kind of with finding that right enemy or that right thing. And I don't know.
Yeah. And a point of clarification, when I say choose one word, the enemy, I am speaking to a very specific subset of men that haven't figured out what they want to do with their life, so they haven't done really anything. And so this is an action of getting the movement, getting familiarizing yourself with movement, of trying things, of getting out in the real world and putting forth effort. It's not something that you would want to build a life on. This is so I agree with you. You don't want to build anything on the negative long term. Now, the idea of evil is highly correlated to the idea of love. Let me put it this way. And I had some back and forth. John Vervaeke gave me a very kind blurb for the book that's on the back of the book. And we had some back and forth about this, right? He's kind of got this Buddhist vibe and practices, and and I'm leading with you got to murder the evil.
That's why it was striking. It was very striking. Yeah.
Yeah. You can't fuck around with evil. You don't do it. You don't do it. You have to realize the difference between a counterparty and an enemy. Counterparties can be negotiate with, but the threat that the counterparty gives you, there's an opportunity buried in that. Maybe it's an opportunity to discover there's a win-win in the situation. There's an opportunity to help that person grow and grow out of that counterparty placement and maybe team up with you at some point. But an enemy definitionally is a threat that does not contain an opportunity. The threat that cannot be converted into an opportunity. And enemies you get rid of. You get rid of. Now, I am not speaking specifically about murdering people, stateside or murdering people, but it's that manifest evil. It's that evil that drives them. You look at Charlie Kirk. He was all in. Same thing with Elon Musk. All in about killing the wokest ideology that's destroyed some of these kids. in their decisions that they've made in public schools outside the reach of their parents. Elon's own son. There is this evil there. But the only way, and let me use Chesterton. This is probably the best way to say it. Talk about the correlation between evil and love. Chesterton says that the soldier goes into war not because he hates the person in front of him, but because he loves those who are behind him. And so it's the same act for that soldier to go fight and try to kill that adversary. But the purpose isn't that he's trying to commit a murder or try to kill someone. The purpose is he's trying to love the people that are behind him. There are threats to your family. There are threats to your friends. There's threats all around you. There's threats to widows and to orphans that are in our presence. In fact, the worst of the threats are always posed against the most vulnerable, which are definitionally the widows and the orphans. And so if you consider yourself a man and you're not really doing anything about that, well, I don't know how much you should consider yourself a man in the long run if you let that just go by. And so we're all called to take up the battle against evil and to annihilate it in some way. A note of caution, though. In his book, James Carr's Finite and Infinite Games, he points out that the greatest evils throughout history have been the attempts, or have been under the promise that they're trying to destroy evil. And the promise of trying to destroy evil with another falsehood or with an evil is itself evil. And so he says that you've got to kind of watch out for that allure that you're going to sort of attack the evil nature. But you've got to figure out, and that's why it's important. It's got to be something that breaks your heart, because you're not going to be passionate about it, and it's got to be something that hurts other people, and it does so in a very, very obvious way. And that's why you want to do that. But if you can't be a man that learns how to fight, you can never become a man who knows how to really love. And that's a very, very important note. And you've heard Peterson talk about iterations of that over time. He says you've got to be a fucking monster on occasion. Yeah. Right. Like that, if you want to be loved, you've got to have the capacity to be that kind of person. You're not that person by default, and then you're on occasion nice. No, you're the nice, loving, compassionate, caring man who's encouraging, but you can be a devil in the right circumstances where needed. You've got to be able to pose a threat. A man who can never threaten death can never have hope of love. We've got to figure out a way that we can complete the full breadth of us as men. It's the Louisian comment in Men Without Chest that we have this divine mind that seeks the divine. We have this belly of the beast where we consume. We want things for ourselves, but we're left as men without chests when we don't know how to put the two together. And that's really what he's calling forth is looking for men with chests. And I think that's what JDP is calling for, and that's what I'm calling for as well. Real men that know how to blend the two in the proper situations, because that's the only way you get the fulfillment of a true relationship of love in the end.
Well, that's being meek, and a lot of people confuse that with weakness. And I know Jordan Peterson talked about that as well. Like being a person who has the capacity to be lethal, and to has also the capacity to know how to restrain that, how to operate with that is, it's admirable. I've struggled my whole life, being kind of more of a musician and in the arts, like thinking about such things in a certain way, and how does that reel? Because I'm a lover, not a fighter, man. And there did come a point in my life where I had to fight for my marriage. Like I had to like literally do everything every ounce of every bit of me aimed at trying to fight for that. And I was and many of that was fighting myself, actually, the evil within me. And I think those, it can, being able to recognize that. And, as I've grown in that experience, I am more able to I believe, to recognize evil when I see it, and when I see it coming due to other acts of evil being bestowed upon me and upon my outside of myself at this point, and then on others that I care about. And realizing that I don't have time, but also that there are people who need to be protected. And one of the most interesting scriptures for me around this and Jesus's teaching is Matthew 7, where he talks about wolves in sheep's clothing. And he goes on to talk about, a millstone would be cast around the neck of those that would harm or lead the little children astray. And he uses this interesting language because he says, be wise as serpents and gentle as doves. Why is Christ calling us to be like the serpent in that regard, related to those that have actual evil intent for the sheep, for the innocent? And that's radically reframed my perceptions on that. And I think our culture, there's one side of our culture that has no problem calling things evil, and the kind of the World War II mythos of Nazi and fascist and all these kinds of things. But there's another, I actually listened to a clip of Charlie Kirk. It was a random kind of off camera clip. And he was saying, until these states like Arkansas and Louisiana, wake up to certain, there's a latent kind of, I don't know, malaise related to evil in a certain way. And so I think that's why it was so stark to read that section of your book related to evil. Yeah, go ahead.
Yeah. Look, there are a certain class of individuals who don't want peace. They just don't want to be hit. They don't want to be shot, but they don't want peace. Rush Limbaugh, I used to listen to him when I was in high school, driving to and from school. My dad always listened to him, so I was kind of stuck listening to him. And he always talked about I think he said that the best path to peace is through war, through defeat. You have to defeat someone in order to be in a peaceful situation. And that's why the wolves of sheep clothing are so dangerous in our churches and our groups and our relationships. That is the passive aggressive person. It's the person that's being coddled by the false shepherd. It is the person that Dostoevsky talked about in the Brothers K in the little story called The Grand Inquisitor. It's necessary for the false good man who's trying to re-kill Christ to be an old man wearing a collar who looks clean and bright and good on the outside. But whenever he enters the cell to talk to Christ, he really displays his evil intent. It's the one that looks good who has sort of that evil inside him. That's dangerous. And that's why a passive aggressive person, I think in my opinion, I think that's the sort of person that Christ is talking about. Even Plato, I think Plato Republic 5, he talks about the worst possible man would look like he's clean, would look like he's a good person on the outside because he'd be able to get away with it. Like you would need the worst possible person to be able to get away with that sort of activity. And so I think that's a big concern right now. So when we see good men, but they're afraid to really stand up for badness or the things that are attacking their family, I think we see that what's inside may not be as good as what's on the outside, and you may not want to know what's in the inside. And so that's these are practices. These are that's what step one's about. Is sort of cobbling together the competency to take a few steps and try some things to learn how the world works, learn different tools to move. And so I think there's a lot to that.
That takes those, when you take the abstract, you said the bits down to the atoms is where your ideas are then tested. For me, that's been I've been a part of helping start a kind of a new church, and I have all these lofty ideas about church history and about, and a lot of these conversations, and they come into contact with real people and people that are in different places, and they have, how do you then communicate, but also try to have conviction about things that you believe are good and true and beautiful even. And so the part moving on in your book, another piece, and this, I think it resonates, it connects well because of, I guess, the brutality of nature has never actually left us. But we live in such abstraction that we a lot of times believe it has in a certain way. And you draw so much from ancient wisdom. You've already quoted Plato. You've already quoted Lewis and others, but that, which he's modern, but like you know what then captured your attention, kept your attention from ancient wisdom? What are some of the who are some of the great minds? You focus a lot. You use Alexander the Great as an archetype throughout your whole book. So kind of talk to us about that relationship and that connection.
Yeah. So Alexander is really interesting figure. And I won't rehash all of this because I think people probably in the corner are probably very well aware of this. But you have a few characters throughout history who have presented themselves as being God-men, half gods, half men. Alexander the Great was one of those individuals. So was Achilles, technically. I guess literally, and I think Hercules, if he ever existed, at least in the Disney sense. And so you have these sorts of occurrences. There's others as well. But if you had to look at the two men that probably changed the world the most, I would say it was probably Alexander the Great and Christ. And if you look at those two things, those two sort of facts, and you see that one called himself a God man, one said that he was God as he's standing there manifest as a man. And when we follow the theology to its logical conclusion, we find out that he's entirely God and entirely man. We see these two corollaries, and we find out that they travel to some of the exact same spaces. They had the same sorts of conversations with the same people. And it just was a natural outflow to link these together in a sort of a path. And so I spent 2 chapters, I think chapters 2 and chapter 3, speaking about Alexander the Great and some of the lessons. Chapter 2 is Alexander the Great's fall, his decline, his as I like to say, aiming low is the only sin. This is his chapter of the fall. But the following chapter 3, is the reascent of Alexander the Great, where he takes up the step where if you don't pick a master, one will be thrust upon you.
Yeah.
He takes that seriously, and he chooses a master, at least for a time. And you see that he was involved in prophecy. In fact, he had a prophecy that was corroborated by the Jewish high priestess prophecy. We don't have time to tell the whole story here, but you have these corroborating prophecies that happen and events that happen in real life, and so that gives us sort of pointers that there may be something or someone intervening from beyond time or from beyond sort of controllable space, and we begin to build from there a narrative about how we are very much like Alexander the Great, more than we could ever imagine.
Yeah. The first point you hit on there is kind of failures and in our lives, and that's a big part of your story related to your journey, to this ascent you already talked about of business success. And there's a great story about some of the exclusive parties that you got to be a part of in your book, and really wild to read. And then like I got to go to a party with Rick Walker at the end of ARC, and we're sitting around a table with Paul Vanderklay and a rowdy group of folks, and that
was fun.
It was fun. But the finding yourself in these places through that journey, like Alexander with this ascent to these places, and then it's like, okay, now like the government power, they influence, and one of the what's really cool is, I won't spoil it for people. I think you've shared this in other places, but that you end up losing, and it's, I basically, if I understand right, like one of the lowest points of your life, if not the lowest point. And then the guy that you lost to ends up writing the foreword to your book that's out. You know, there's like a full circle there. But another big theme is that in your book, and this is going back to kind of this Petersonian thing as well, about sacrifice and trust, and these big words, these that for me are also very, very real. And I think that's the thing that, I guess, what feels like we've been pointing at is these, you know, it's not just who's right, like, and who can we logically figure out metaphysics and all those kinds of things. It's like, are you becoming a person that people can trust? And are you willing to do whatever it takes to protect, to rebuild, to love? And but a lot of times that seems to come from a lot of failure. And if we don't take a step of trust, even in a certain sense in ourselves, I would even say that we will never have the actual grace of failing. What would you say about that experience of what I think is failure a okay term to use?
Oh, yeah.
What would you trade that low? Like, that's the interesting paradox of that stuff.
Yeah. So I set out writing a book that entirely covered the top part of that ladder of abstraction, kind of up here. And then I started including some of the classics, some notes from that. Not a lot, but a little bit there. And I realized whenever I sent it over to the editor that there were no sort of personal stories there. There's nothing that sort of grounded the reader in what I was and who I was. So they never knew like who was actually speaking to them.
Yeah.
Like you'd have to go off the authority of the book, or you had to go to my website to see what I'd done or what I hadn't done. And so the premise is that I'm going to cover the entirety of the ladder of abstraction. There's some parts that are very technically difficult to read in that book in small chunks that you have to concentrate. But for the most part, what my aim is to show you that I think that I probably had at one point, or maybe have now, what most men that are 25 to 45 years old want. And so that's why, the GQ parties, the relationships, things like that, I want to put in those there very early to ground, right? The ladder has to be standing on something to ground. This is the voice that you're hearing there. But then also we cover the failure very early as well. And what Christian's talking about is I ran for Congress about 7 or 8 years ago, and I just took an outright beating. And the person that beat me ended up writing the cover of the foreword to the book. He actually is a New York Times bestselling author himself. So I was very honored that he would do that. But for someone like me who's sort of hidden in an office all day, I never really had a public loss, like a public L. Like no one knew whether I lost or won. Maybe a counterparty negotiation or something, or someone in the accounting department knew I lost, a transaction or out negotiated or something like that, but never took a loss. And then I take this congressional run seriously. I go for it, and I get a text message with a screenshot of NBC National News showing me as a loser. Well, you're definitionally a loser if NBC National News calls you a loser and then quantifies the amount that you are a loser next to it. You're a double loser if you get that text message from your own mother, which that was me. And so throughout the book, in addition to showing you that I had at one point, or maybe have now, what a lot of these men would want, so that I have something to offer, I also wanted to show different types of authenticity where I took losses, where I misjudged a situation, where I made outright mistakes. And you'll see that characterized throughout the book, because I think in the end, we all make not all the same mistakes, but some of our mistakes are similarly overlapping in nature. And I think for me anyway, it's been one ego train after another that's derailed and down and plummeted to hell. But but yeah. So I mean that's part of the thing is I want to just show some authenticity there. Because if I can't build trust, remember I started off by saying that authenticity and trust are highly correlated. If I can't show authenticity, you're not going to trust what I say. And if you don't trust what I say, like what are we doing? And so that's really sort of the backgrounding of how that book is approached.
Yeah, that's so much of, again, like a downstream, I don't know, paying homage or whatever you want to call it, but like realizing that, we don't. I had this image, I guess I don't know if it was today or yesterday, and I was thinking about how the whole new atheism thing that was sweeping the pre-Jordan Peterson, that was kind of the thing in the intellectual space, and so much of that was to be able to kind of do this meme of the guy with raising his glasses and actually and saying, actually, like that was the purpose, it felt like, of what people wanted to be able to just kind of do with facts and logic. And what Peterson came in and really changed the game. And he said he'll say the one thing that the postmoderns got right is that so much of what we actually trust or believe in is narrative and story. And I do, that radically shifted my mind related to my own experiences with how I approach like scripture, but also communicating, like you're saying, is that story. I mean, and you just talked to Jonathan Pageau. I don't, if y'all got into that, but that's his big project with what he's doing with like the fairy tales. And so to hear that kind of reflected in what you're doing and where that came from makes total sense. There's something that I've been kind of focused on lately, and I feel like we're in a weird time because there's, we can say woke and we kind of know what that means, but I do feel like now, in a certain way, culturally, the conservative or the right or there's now another question arising about identity. And you're talking about being like identifying with like Alexander the Great, identifying with Christ, MAGA. There's now these things that we're beginning to. Have you been thinking or and I don't know, maybe within your book, like themes of identity, like has that been present in your mind recently?
Yes, quite a bit. I'm thinking about pivoting the company to a place where I can fully disclose the entire identity of what I believe and try to use that as a tool in a very, very open way. And knowing that will drive out a lot of the folks that we work with. But so I've thought a little bit about this. Let me go back to Chesterton on this, though.
Yeah.
Chesterton, this is the thought that I had the first time Trump was running for president. Chesterton says, I would take a competent Turk over an incompetent Christian any day. I would take a competent Turk over an incompetent Christian any day. The identity of who we align with has to be situated in the role or the identity in which we're hoping that they'll play, right? So for instance, president, I'm looking for competency. I'm looking for deal-making skills. I'm looking for, obviously, honesty and truthfulness on that level. Am I going to trust everyone that's done the things that the president has done exclusively on an area of my life? Am I going to let that person, teach me theology? Probably not. But maybe one day. I don't know. I don't know what the Lord's going to do. But I think that identifying and classifying it are worthwhile shortcuts to know where you and I have overlaps, and then also where we have potential areas of friction. And right, and it's the areas of the friction in our conversation that lead to the fruit. It's not, yeah, we both agree with this, we both agree with this. Like that's meaningless. It's those areas where we don't agree or we don't quite communicate well enough, where to articulate what our true stances are, or maybe we haven't fleshed those things out. Those are the areas where we're going to bear fruit long term. But from an identity standpoint, and I'm speaking outside of the kind of the TLC area, identity, I think, is going to become more and more important. And it's not only shorthand of what you believe, but also an area for bunching together coalitions. You're going to see this, and in fact, you're seeing this now in the New York mayoral elections, where there's a threat to one of the two parties, and you see Cuomo coming in as the third party to be able to build coalitions, and so he's trying to wait and get the Republicans to kind of back out so he can coalesce and have more votes to keep the Islamic fascist out. I think coalitions are probably going to be more likely, right? I think the U.S. is one of the very few countries that only has two parties, and so you're probably working with three, 4, 5 parties. It would be my guess 50 years from now. And so identity is going to be a great shorthand tool, but also a great tool to get people to lock into what they believe and stop the meandering, stop the non-committal. Because if you're not willing to commit to even the nuanced ideas when they're important, especially in society, what are you doing? You should be playing in that space. Right? If you can't commit to the Trinitarian unity of the Father and the Son and the Holy Spirit, and realize there's a reason why that's a masculine identity, and that your priests, they should have a masculine voice to go with the masculine identity. And as Lewis says, I'm going back to Lewis again. I love these Brits. It's not a mistake why all the Jewish priests had masculine voices to speak for the masculine deity, right? It's not a mistake. And you see the Archbishop of Canterbury again in London make this mistake, and so you'll see this. But I made a little challenge. This is a little side topic. I made a challenge to Jonathan Pageau. I said, I believe that this woman Archbishop of Canterbury that they put in place, that it's a lifetime appointment, that she will be displaced because they have to move up the rung of victimhood. Like it's not good enough that they have a Caucasian female in that role now. That was traditionally always a male role. They're going to have to go either to a transvestite, or here's what I think, because there's so much influence from London in that role. I think that we will see it in our lifetimes, which he didn't like this. We will see in our lifetimes, we will see an Islamic Archbishop of Canterbury. The true church, the true Anglican Church has already left that Anglican Church. They're already gone. They seated last week. And so we're going to see that. But identity is critical to that. You've seen it in all the denominations. You've seen it in all the DEI, the ESG. You've seen it across the board, identity. And if we can lock in identity and say, we're going to reject the thing that you say I should be, and I'm just going to name the thing that I really am, well, I think that's a better place to be. It's more authentic, more honest place to be.
As the kids would say, it's more based in reality, and I think you said two things there. One, about your company being more open about a certain part of the identity of that, and I'm curious about that. And the other is about the, I guess, factions within movements, where when I'm listening to that, and what we've experienced and been able to see very clearly, as I mentioned kind of earlier, and you were poking at it with the woke stuff, is they actually have been doing that longer, playing those games longer than kind of the conservative was kind of just trying to hold on to maybe a singular identity or a, I don't know, like, but what Charlie Kirk figured this out, and that was, it seems like, from what I can understand, he was kind of a glue that was beginning to do that, which made him very dangerous to the left, was because he helped MAGA get RFK and align these different things in the work that he was doing. And then the other piece that you were talking about is your company. What do you mean specifically about that? If you're able to say about identity with your company.
Yeah, let me go back and address your first comments. I think that was so good. It began in the 1960s, specifically at UCLA, with critical theory.
Right.
Critical theory sought to displace the idea that agency and identity were cohabitants. That if you're to give someone identity and you're able to stick up for them for rights, they should also have agency over those rights. In business, we would say that the people that have the responsibility also need to have the authority. That people have authority, they should have responsibility to execute that authority correctly. And this is where you start to see in the 1970s the rise of the welfare queen, the woman that had as many kids as she could for the welfare check. It wasn't her fault, but us as a society, she was the victim of that. So we had to support her, and that got to be sort of the golden ticket there. And you see that more, throughout. And we talked about with the church. The moving up the rungs of victimhood from transvestites to Islamic believers, obviously from male to women. So they're moving up that rung of victimhood there because they do not want to acknowledge that the responsibility and the authority cohabitate. Every functioning society, you have to have the two things cohabitate. And so Kirk, when he reaches out to JFK or RFK, he knows that they have that basis, that we have a responsibility if we're given the authority. We have a responsibility to fix the food system, to fix the healthcare. We have a responsibility to hold people accountable for the things they should have done. People have a responsibility to self-govern where they can and remove the federal aspect out of that. People have a responsibility to spend their money and not to have the money forcibly removed from their pocketbooks through their paychecks and spent by the government who's given it to, God knows where, for LGBTQ uses, for other, foreign governments, for propping up dictators. And from that central theme that there's responsibility to have, right? We see the same thread going all the way back to the 1960s. Peterson addresses it. The president is addressing it now. Elon addressed it. The subject of identity, responsibility, and kind of wokeist critical theory, maneuvering its way, trying to find a place to inhabit. Those things are all integrated. And responsibility is the cure for those ideologies, because responsibility is the only thing that gives the individual true agency. And if you don't have agency, I can never blame you for anything. It's the person that stays in the top of the ladder of abstraction. He never sets any concrete goals, so he never loses. He thinks he wins, but he only loses because he never comes down here, does anything in the real concrete world. He doesn't have agency. He rejects agency when he stays up here. He embraces agency when he stays down here. He takes the L on national news. He gets the text that he lost on NBC National News because you try something. You try something, and that's what all this is pointing to. Is we've got to try some stuff. We got to get used to losing. Life is only a string of failures with occasional moment of perfection. Is all it is.
String of failures with occasional moments of perfection. Yeah. So then the other piece I was asking, like, what do you, if you can kind of outline a little bit, what do you mean by you becoming your business having more of an identity or more transparent identity? What is that? What does that mean?
Yeah. So I've always been afraid to put a Christian label on it, or even put a conservative label on it, not because I'm ashamed of that, because I can't control everything that happens within the company. And I can't control people's perspectives. And so if someone were to say some employee did something in this Christian company, I don't want to make God look bad. Just kind of use a kind of a broad statement there. And so that's always been a little bit of a hindrance. But I'm starting to come around to the realization that maybe identity in the externally facing elements of our lives is the only thing you can really lead with. There's nothing else to lead with. So if I lead with that, hey, we can invest your capital and make a great safe yield on it by buying these buildings, well, that's one thing. But what they really want to know is how we're going to do that what our underlying philosophies are. And are we just going to misuse the money? No. If I tell you we're a conservative Christian company and this is what we believe, and you can get a pretty good framework for how your money's going to be treated or how your buildings are going to be treated. You're going to get a pretty good concept there. And so it's one of those shortcuts. But I'm starting to think in an external facing relationship where you're trying to build new relationships and be able to reinforce old relationships, that maybe identity is the only real starting point, because everything else they dig down through the information to try to identify what the identity is.
That the way I relate to that from the world that I have the most experience in related to church is this is something I've been thinking a lot about, especially in this space where there's a lot of people discuss different traditions, and that I've kind of come to this point, like we kind of had this ambiguous community of people, and then we're going to become a church. Well, what kind of church? And I thought it was important, and I put it forward that we should say what we are, because there's this trend across evangelicalism to they're basically Baptist, but they don't want to say they're Baptist because they don't want to be identified with X, Y, Z. And so then what are you? Well, we're just Christian. Okay, well, help me find out what that means, because the Archbishop of Canterbury's Christian, so like it is becoming more interesting. I think even subconsciously, I'm like, well, I'm putting these pictures up in my studio and stuff, and things that I identify with, what has helped me, what formed and shaped me, what story am I a part of? And, and even this is like, so we became this, have you hugged a Presbyterian today? So that's what we ended up being, not because, at this point, I'm like, I'm just like the most Presbyterian person that you will ever meet. It's not really, but I am choosing to be a part of that story, that history, that tradition, and allow that to inform certain things and shape it, and not be embarrassed by that, because they all come with foibles, and everyone's anxiety is like, and so if you don't identify in a certain way as a conservative or a Christian company, that comes with its own things. And if you do, it comes with its own things. And then we're weighing like, well, maybe the things it comes with, there are still maybe some drawbacks, but maybe these other things outweigh that, as we weigh those things together. But that's definitely been something that makes a lot of sense to me.
Oh, yeah. And I think if you have a visitor attend your church and you're non-denominational, they're going to be wondering if it's someone that's from an educated background or from any sort of doctrinal background. They're going to be wondering, like, what is this really? Yeah. And when they finally have that conversation with the lead pastor or whoever it is, the lead pastor will do something like this: like, we were all trained in the Southern Baptist methodology, or we were all, it's kind of like Methodism, but what we do this. And so interesting thing, talk about churches, and I'm sure no one from my church is in this corner. And so I attend a pretty decent sized church, and I just got done with a 1.5-year process. I chaired the pastor search committee. We're looking for a new pastor after like 20 years. And it's interesting to see that the Baptists now have multiple systematic theology books. And so you have to dive into which systematic theology book were they trained on, and what do they believe and what they do not believe out of there. So for instance, there are theologies within the Southern Baptist tradition. I don't know if it's the tradition, but it's within the Southern Baptist realm, the Southern Baptist schools, where they use a systematic theology where it teaches you that the Father is subservient to the Son within the Trinitarian unity. Well, my daughter knows that's not right. Or there's other occurrences with gender ideology. There's things like that. And so when you say you're a Southern Baptist, well, yeah, that tells me a lot. And I thought before a 1.5 years ago, that told me a lot. Like, yeah, I can, that's normal. I can adapt to that. But these days they're mixing everything in, and they're trying to change definitions. And that's really the tragic thing that's that's happened. You've seen 4 of the 5 largest U.S. denominations split over the matter of gender identity. When there's 3 really, actually there's 2 really easy things that every church should be doing right now to fix this. Because we almost went through a church split over gender identity without a pastor, like months ago. They don't realize that, and I'm not going to say what church I go to, but I knew that from where I sat. I was getting threats, I was getting promises, I was getting all sorts of things, but it was the same 1960s wokeist playbook. Like, I had seen this story 100 other times. They had played it out in all the other denominations already. Like, there's nothing surprising. You're gonna say something in private. You're gonna build a coalition. You're gonna be a little bit louder. You're gonna claim victimhood. After you claim victimhood, you're gonna take it public, and you're gonna say, "Look what they tried to do to me." It's the same systematic playbook over and over. There's no strategic thought in this. And so when, like, months before it happens, I lay it out for the other deacons, like, "Hey guys, this is what's going to happen," and they followed it to a T, because they have no imagination. They have no imagination. But there's 2 things every church should do, like immediately. You should adopt two statements about identity. Number 1 is the Danvers statement, and the number 2 is the Nashville statement. Both statements have been signed on by almost every single major church and pastor that you can imagine. John MacArthur, John Piper, Tim Keller, like everyone who's anyone has signed on to both those statements, and you can embed those within your church bylaws. But that will basically remove the probability that you're going to have one of these splits, like every other church denomination, because you hear about church denomination splits, you don't hear about church splits too. Those are happening. Those are fracturing every day over the same thing. And why would you not take the biblical definition of gender? Like, because you want to invent your own scripture, right? Yeah. So those are 2 steps. So the Danvers statement and the Nashville statements are sort of good solid statements that I encourage anyone that's starting a church, trying to look for a theology behind a church, to adopt early, because once you realize you need it, once you realize you're having the gender conversations, it's way too late.
Right. And these are one of the things that I've thought recently about, because this also is tied into marriage, as well. And that the Catholic sacrament, having a sacramental understanding of marriage, and that being built in as the foundation that we're talking about. And Luther and Calvin called it like a natural ordinance, but they didn't give it sacramental placeholder like communion and baptism. Obviously there's other ones, there's other rites in the Catholic, there's like 7 sacraments, but I have thought about how it taking for granted that normative thing would be attacked. Why would this need to be recognized as something holy and sacred, above some other things? And so I've definitely thought about that recently, related to that, and encourage, I think, as part of my work in this channel, is kind of encouraging a sacramental understanding of the world, that there are things that God has made that we get real grace from through these ways, and that being one of them. And the other piece is related to, like I was saying, we're coming to the end of like, oh, we don't want to be associated with Baptists. We're not going to put that in our name. And it's like, well, then it becomes ambiguous and arbitrary, and you are beginning to just, there are questions about tradition. There are questions about history that are starting to really show their head, because that's another part of, I think, that very hyper individualistic nature of church and just me and my personal relationship with Jesus. Then everything's going to be okay. And then you come into situations like this, where you actually have to depend upon history and tradition. And even when they might say, as someone who was trained, like I went to Southern Baptist undergrad and studied theology, it's like, oh, well, we take this for granted in a certain way. I think that's shifting in this relationship to identity. Well, as we're kind of coming towards the end of our time here, what's something that you want everyone to really know about your book and about your work on the internet with your podcasting and what you're doing? We've talked about your business, but like, what about on this kind of more creative side of Rick Walker? What is kind of an idea or something you really want people to latch onto?
Yeah. So I'm not a serious podcaster like you are, Christian. I'm very sporadic. And so I would say if someone identifies with these sorts of meanderings, I wouldn't call them thoughts, I would call them meanderings. The book would be a great place to put it. The Kindle version is almost always a lot cheaper than the paperback version. If you like to read paper, the hardback. I know I was talking about the hardcover. I make less money on the hardcovers than I do on the paperbacks. The hardcovers, which is like $30 on Amazon. That's my favorite. I'm proud of the hardcover. It's very. I use the guy that did Morgan Housel's books to do the layout, and he just did a fantastic job with that. And so it's interesting to read that and see the text call outs and see the layout of that, I think. And so that's a lot of, if you like someone like some markup in their book, the hardcover is a great option. I also do a newsletter. It's about 20,000 folks every other week right now. And it's a 3-2-1 format. So you're getting 3, what I call bangers. So kind of killer quotes. Number 2, you're getting 2 questions generally, and then you'll get either a video or you'll get some sort of meditative thought or questions that you can think about in your quiet time. It's not sort of a faith-driven type of newsletter. It's something that's more practical, more functional, and it's reflective. And so that's free. And if someone, if there's someone that's watching and would love a copy of the book and they just can't afford, they can reach out and I'll send you one for free. I'm really committed to making sure people, especially in TLC, have access to the book if they'd like one. So just feel free to, message me on LinkedIn or X or somewhere, and I'd be happy to get that for folks. But yeah, I'm really focused right now, Christian, on maximizing the number of people that read that book and work through the process that I laid out. Again, it's not for the people that are, that know what they want. It's for the people that don't know quite what they want. People that are looking for a vision of what's possible, not a vision of how I'm gonna embarrass myself yet again. And so hopefully that speaks to the right audience, get kind of 25 to 45-year-old men that are in this vervaking and meaning crisis.
Well, I'll testify to it. It was a deep encouragement. I was sent Rick a few messages as I was making my way through it, and was very encouraged, very kindred in a lot of ways, and also got some great lore about the Rick Walker of Texas businessman in there. So Rick, I really appreciate you. All this stuff will be linked in his podcast, and then also his book and his website where you can get a hold of the newsletter. And if you've made it this far, I really appreciate you staying around. Leave a comment. I'm sure there were plenty of things people might, find some friction with or whatever. And let's keep the conversation going. So Rick, thanks for coming on yours truly today, man.
Appreciate you, man.
Hey everyone, I hope you really enjoyed this conversation I had with Rick Walker today. If you're still hanging around here after the show, I want to encourage you to watch this video. But unless this one interests you more, and if you want to keep up with the podcast, click on this link right down here. Leave a comment.